Hi guys, it's Professor Fernandez, and here's just the next video about plot. The first video we talked about your typical average um, triangle structure. It's actually called a plot diagram. Aristotle's Poetics, narrative arc, however you want to call it. We talked about that, and I introduced you to that college style because this is something that we've all been indoctrinated with since elementary school. The next structure I want to talk about is the three-act structure. You may also be familiar with it, or you may have heard of it. It's, again, like I've said in the first video, there are similarities among all three of these. In fact, I'm only showing you three structures. There's actually more structures. If you have heard about something called the hero's journey, that is also a plot structure. I am not teaching hero's journey in this class because that's more of a creative plot structure. And by creative, I mean that's something that creative writers use to create stuff. We are actually looking at dissecting the plot to find the argument or the argument statement in there. So I'm not going to go through hero's journey, but if you know anything about hero's journey, a lot of what I'm going to say today is going to sound pretty familiar. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. We're going to do the three-act structure, and it's exactly how it sounds. There are three acts, and in those three acts, certain things have to happen. So I'm going to go ahead and do a screen share as usual, because that's what I do. And we are going to go ahead and draw on this three-act structure visual. This is actually in your module, so you'll be able to look at this as we go along. I'm going to write all over this in blue ink because that is what I do. You're more than welcome to print this out or write on it at your leisure or just take notes. So as we can see, there are three acts, 1, 2, 3. And I kind of want you to actually denote the shading here because it's not shaded because, shading is fun and it looks really nice. I want you to see how much shading is here with the gray and then how much shading is with the white. Do you see how the second act has the biggest slice of the pie here? That means that most of the story is going to happen in the second act. If you've ever heard writers talk about the sagging middle, this is the second act. It's super easy to write the beginning. It's super easy to write the end. It's super hard to write the stuff in the middle. So this is the second, the part that's in the middle. It takes the most of the story. Most of the story happens in the second act. And a lot of things happen there. I also want you to see kind of what the goal is for each act, right? So the goal of the act one is the setup. It sets up the story. If you remember in our last conversation, we talked about exposition in the plot structure and that the triangle plot structure I like to call it's the Aristotle's Poetics, it's the narrative arc structure, whatever you want to call it. It's similar here in that it talks about the ordinary world, but there is an exciting incident that has to happen that sets up the story. It's kind of like the why of things. We'll talk about inciting incident in a minute. And that moves us into the first plot point, which is really right on the border between Act 1 and Act 2. It's the thing that happens that moves us from one act to the next act. Then within that act, there's going to be confrontation, and this is like conflict, right? The conflict that is happening in the other plot, in the other structure, the narrative arc structure. So it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be the face-off between two people. It can mean that. It just means there's a confrontation of some sort, confrontation of self, the confrontation of society, the confrontation of rules or bucking up to rules. We're going to actually talk about Harrison Bergeron and its three-act structure to kind of point that out. Within the second act, you also have the midpoint. And that necessarily doesn't mean the climax because it's in the third act. It doesn't really also necessarily mean the actual legit middle of the story. I don't want you to count paper pages and say, all right, in this 4-page story, page 2.5 is the exact middle. So that should be the midpoint. No, we're actually talking about the story, the midpoint of the story. Then there's a plot point that takes us from Act 2 into Act 3 that drives us into the climax. Remember, climax means tension here. So it drives us into the tension point of the story. And then we have a resolutions. And the goal here in Act 3 is to resolve it. I want you to see how what we don't have in the 3-act structure that we do have in the former structure, the plot structure, or the narrative arc structure, however you want to call it, is resolution, or resolution in that the ordinary world, or we know what the world is like after the big thing that happens, right? It just says resolution. That right here happens right there, right here, right? So after the climax, the world returns, but it's a little different than it was before. So let's talk a little bit about Harrison Bergeron and how it fits here. So Act 1 is to set up, again, set up exposition. We know that the world, this is a future world. We know that something happened to push the world to 200 plus amendments. Yeah, it takes a lot to pass an amendment. We've only passed 26 of them. Now it's 200 plus, right? And so something has happened where everybody has come to an agreement that the way to live to make sure that equality happens is that we have these situations happening, the handicaps and whatnot. The handicap in general is set up and whatnot. So that's the setup. And we have the inciting incident. So the inciting incident, what that means, it's the thing that pushes the story forward, that kind of pops and say, oh, okay, the story kind of starts here, right? Again, pushing the story forward or pushing the narrative forward, pushing the plot forward. Those are all the same phrases to say that the story starts to move. It's not staying the same. Something happens, and then as a result of this happening, the other thing happens, and the result of that thing, the next thing happens, and that's how the story moves. So we have this, and things are being set up. We're learning the learning in Harrison Bergeron the rules of the world. Of course, the setting is happening. And really nothing really happens until there's a bulletin, and the bulletin says that Harrison has escaped, right? The inciting incident is Harrison escaping, right? This is happening off stage. And by that, I mean, it happens, but we don't see it happening. We hear that it has, or when it's already have happened. So here, the inciting incident is Harrison escapes. You can say here and make an argument for Harrison being arrested as the inciting incident. And you can make that. And I will be willing to hear that argument. I'm going to argue that the inciting incident is when Harrison escapes, because that's when the story starts moving. That's when you start seeing things happening. Then it moves on to the next thing, the first plot point, the border between Act 1 and Act 2 right here with Harrison is right there when they read the bulletin. Right, and there you see they stop dancing and the news person can't read it, so then one of the ballerinas reads it, and you see the bulletin, right? You hear that he has escaped. So the inciting incident makes it happen is Harrison escaping, right? We don't get to see it, but we hear about it in the plot point 1. If Harrison didn't escape, there would be no story. This is your conflict, or one of your conflicts, right? And then we move into the confrontation essentially. And then we have like the idea of like the midpoint. And much of the world or the story happens here. This is all Harrison, you know, him coming up on stage, talking to the ballerina, dancing with the ballerina, whatnot. And the midpoint right here is like Harrison coming up on stage, coming on TV, and the whole nine, that shocking thing. And then the event that leads us from Act 2 to Act 3 is kind of muddy right here, because everything happens very quickly. And if you remember the last structure, you could see like the ticking up to the climax and then the sharp fall, right? And so the plot point here, plot point 2, it could be when the ballerina and Harrison dance. You can make that a plot point because after that, the climax happens and it happens rather quickly. And that is important because it's a direct defiance of what's going on. A plot point 2 could be the ballerina taking off handicaps, right? Because that's also a confrontation as well. And I want to pause here and say, when you think of confrontation, you probably went directly to Handicapper General and Harrison Bergeron. And that is a confrontation, but it's not the confrontation in Act 2. Remember, going down the merry yellow brick road. Whew. Two of my analogies got mixed up in my head there for a second. And we're taking it kind of like one plot point at a time, right? So confrontation doesn't necessarily have to be between protagonist and antagonist in this particular structure. Harrison is on TV. He is confronting literally the society that locked them up. Literally everybody on TV, all them eyes, all that, the band that's playing, the ballerinas, whatever, right? So you have all this happening, and so that's a confrontation. So again, confrontation does not necessarily have to mean between one person and another. It can, but it could be people actually confronting the status quo, where Harrison is confronting the status quo. The ballerina who takes off her handicaps is confronting the status quo. The band is attempting to confront the status quo. So we have all that happening, right? And so that is going to be that's so weird. Thanks, somebody who's sending me a messenger announcement at this moment. What's going on? Okay, all right, great. So that's what's happening right now. And then you have Act 3, which is the resolution. And within the resolution, you see how it's really short. So the plot point brings us into Act 3 to the climax. And the climax is like the thing with the most tension. The most tension is literally Harrison being shot down by Diana Glompers. So you have a couple of plot points here that leads us into Act 3. Another one, of course, is Diana Glompers coming in, the Handicapper General, in her presence. It could be a plot point that takes us from Act 2 to Act 3. You could argue any of these and do well with that. It all depends on you and how you are interpreting this plot and how you want to argue this plot, depending on the argument you make. So consider the argument that you're making, and that will tell you what your plot points are. Ha ha ha. See, you thought that this was cut and dry, but it is not. It takes critical thinking. I'm actually making you think while you're reading. I'm I'm so awful, I know. Okay, so right here, I'm gonna argue here that the climax is Harrison being shot down, and the resolution here, of course, the world's a little more gray, a little more dark. Hazel crying, doesn't know that she's literally just seen her son being killed on national television. But she's sad about it, right? So the world is a little different, it's a little grayer. And this is your 3-act structure. This is essentially how this story is happening. So when you're looking at this story, you're writing about it, say in your story chart, if I'm making you do a story chart, or if I'm making you do a presentation or a discussion post about it, and if I'm making you do a paper, and you're looking at plot, you definitely want to pick one of these structures that I'm talking about, and you want to explain what the structure is, 2, what is happening in each act. Like act 1 will have an exciting incident. It will be a plot point that leads us from act 1 to act 2. There will be a midpoint that's happening in act 2 where there is a confrontation of some sort. There will be a plot point at the end of act 2 that leads us into act 3 where there will be a climax and a resolution. That's how you'll explain it. And then you will tell me, you will literally fill in the gaps. In act 1, this is the setup. This is how this is set up. This is the exposition that's happening. And then Harrison escaping is the inciting incident that kicks off the story, or that makes or moves the story forward, right? And that's how you'll explain it. So what I don't want to see in your story charts, and especially in your papers, you just dumping what I just said into an Excel box or into a paper. There should be some finesse with it. You're trying to tell me and show me that you've learned. So that's the big deal. That's the 3-act structure here. It's not a difficult structure. None of these structures that I'm showing you are difficult at all. It just takes some thinking, some methodical thinking, and thinking it through, and knowing why something's an inciting incident or a plot point, or why it is the climax, and why the resolution is the resolution. Let's go and talk about juxtaposition again in this video, like we talked in the last video. When you're looking at juxtaposition, and what that actually means is that you're looking at one thing compared to the other, and the relationships to each other create an argument or says something about the thing, right? When you're looking at plot, it's really, the one thing you definitely want to look at is the juxtaposition of the beginning to the end. What the world was like before all the things happen, and what the world is like after all the things happen. It could be that your setting changes, doesn't necessarily change, but it can change. Something like Popular Mechanics, by the way. Popular Mechanics, if you're juxtaposing the beginning to the end, you have a setting change. Your setting went from big to small in something like Popular Mechanics. You're juxtapositioning the idea of the big scene of it being dark and snow melting and dirty and you barely see the sun, to the ending where the sun is kind of peeking through, but it's still dark. It's even darker and colder inside. In the room of the house where it's usually the warmest because the oven's there, right? The cooking's there. That's where people eat. Like before dinner, you're sneaking in like taste testings of things, right? So that juxtaposition between the macro idea of what it's like to the micro idea of what it ended up being, and what happens to the child at the end, is a juxtaposition. And so what is Raymond Carver saying between the beginning and the ending? There is a change there. The world is darker. It does not get warmer. It gets gloomier. So just like Harrison Bergeron, the world's a little fatter, right? You will see there will be a story here where the world gets a little bit better, right? And so, what is the writer saying? What's the juxtaposition between the beginning and the end? What is Raymond Carver saying about the world before what happened to this child and this couple, and what happened after? What is the world like after this thing happens, right? He doesn't give us much as a minimalist story. Of course, he doesn't give us much. He gives us a line and then we have to fill in the blanks. What is that blank, right? And that is where the argument is. And that's where you start beginning to build your argument. Okay, I'm done with this video. I'll see you in the next video where we talk about another plot structure. Bye, guys.